that it's a kind of a unique sort of project for a cultural institution. What do I mean by that? Well, these kinds of projects, which are about co-creation, which are quite low budget, which are outdoors, which are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's not super common for museums in general, but particularly architecture and design museums. For me, an architecture and design museum should build architecture and should build works of design. And so over many years at Arkdes, we've been prototyping public spaces at full scale, outdoors, around the museum. And Michaëlsson's project here is a part of that long continuum. However, at this point, we're just about to reopen the museum after a year of renovation and a full reorganization and reconfiguration of our internal spaces and a new kind of exhibition program. And so in a way, Michaëlsson's project is part of a continuum of projects that are outdoors, that are full scale, that are inhabitable, but it's also the start of something new. It's the start of also a different kind of pedagogical space, a different kind of space that allows for play and generosity in that sense. And so from that perspective, we couldn't have asked anyone better to do this. We started this in early autumn last year. So it's a very short project, and it was a little bit of the situation that we were in was we have this idea, we want to occupy this space, which is a very strange kind of space at the very back of the museum with this incredible view of the city, but somehow a little bit shaded, particularly in early and late summer. In summer, high summer, it's very hot here. The sun comes down and there's not much shade. We knew we wanted to do something here. And the question of precisely what that would be, we didn't know. And we really wanted to hand that question over to Michaëlsson. And that's a little bit of a process that we tend to work in here. You know, it requires a lot of trust to the people that you invite in, but that trust always pays off. I think Michaëlsson had worked with Arkdes before. Arkdes is a very old institution. Goes back to 2015 as its current name, but also goes back to the 1970s as the Architecture Museum. Michaëlsson held a research position here, I think around 2016, 2017. But as you know as well, museums that have this long timeline, they go through moments. We've been in a particular moment right now with people involved and certain approaches. And one of our approaches has been very much to think about public space and what we call public life. Public life is a very intangible concept. It's very difficult to translate out of English, right? But it's really about the civic potential of public spaces. And we consider the museum, all the interior spaces of this museum, as public space. It's owned by the state. It's paid for by taxpayers in Sweden. So it has that kind of important civic duty. But then that also extends the spaces outside. And I like this blurry boundary, you know? But it's not just defined by a door. There is this kind of question, especially when we're dealing with architecture and design, of how this sort of node in the city bleeds into the kind of urban fabric of the city. You know, one of the big, I guess, questions about the architecture exhibition is, why would you make an exhibition about architecture when the entire city is essentially an exhibition about architecture, right? And my response to that is, sure, you're right, but here we're trying to focus in on things that don't happen in the city. So one of the reasons why we have been prototyping public spaces is because as a cultural institution, we can approach architects, designers, space makers as artists, and we can foreground their imagination. We can foreground their desire and will, and we can create a space where that can happen. And that's what this project represents too. You know, I think that there are two ways of looking at a city like Stockholm. Right? On the one hand, you can say that it's very progressive and that it has a lot of kinds of spaces that many other capital cities don't have. And there's a certain generosity to the kind of publicness of the city, but also the amount of nature as well that's present in Stockholm. On the other hand, you could say that it's incredibly homogeneous, very cautiously designed and programmed, and therefore sits in this kind of liminal space, right, where it's neither good nor bad. And that's what I think. I think Sweden is neither good nor bad, Stockholm in particular. There is a fear, I think, among the people who make the city that, you know, inviting people who might have an artistic practice is potentially dangerous, or expensive, or who knows where they'll end up, right? And part of the work that we do as a museum is to say, well, no, actually, this can work out. Look at what we can make. This project by Mikit is really an experiment in co-creation, right? It's tons of kids over the course of months have added and built and developed and grown, but not just kids, adults, people who spend their days on this island, planting tomatoes, watering the plants. So it's all a kind of an attempt to sort of prove that you can have a constructed, designed space that has freedom built into it. And I think that when you walk around the city, what you often don't see is that kind of slipperiness or that kind of nuance. What you see is hard surfaces, right? And if you don't see hard surfaces, you see a children's playground. And they're never really combined. What this space does is combine those two things. And that's what makes it very important for the questions of public spaces in Stockholm. And it's what makes it quite innovative. Have fun. The request was have fun. Let's see what we can imagine. Like I said, the budget was quite small. The timeline was quite tight. And Mikit are experts at sort of working within frameworks. They're very experienced also with working with institutions, right, which are very large clients in a way. They know how to carve out their space, and they know how to construct integrity within that space. And so in a way, it was a total joy just to be able to be beside them on this journey that led to this. And of course, when we opened this project, it looked nothing like it does now, right? And it's been on this ongoing journey since then. And that is a really important lesson for a museum to understand, for example. It's something that now, when we're talking about the future of this museum, we can start to point at this project, right? And say, well, look, it works. Something is happening that maybe we never thought of. And that's sort of the secondary power of a project like this.